Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a final review of the AYN Odin 2. Now I've had this device for about a week and a half now, doing all sorts of testing. I also did a couple videos. I did an impressions video and then also a deep dive into Nintendo Switch emulation. This video is going to be a continuation of that trilogy, where we're going to do a final review and talk about whether or not it's going to be worth it for you. Now the way I see it, there are probably 4 different types of people watching this video. The first are the diehards, the people that have already purchased this, and they're just looking for validation that they made the right choice, and I'm here to tell you that yes, you did. Now, on the second group, it's going to be people who probably already have a retro handheld, maybe a Retroid Pocket or something like that, and they're just not really sure it's worth the investment price of about $300 plus to get the Odin 2 and whether or not it's going to be worth it. I think we will address that in this video too. Now, the third group is going to be those who don't have any handhelds at all, but they're interested. You know, they're looking at maybe a Steam Deck or the Odin 2, and they're not really sure which direction to go, and they need a nudge one way or the other. And so I'm hoping this video will also address those concerns. Then finally, we have our fourth group, and that's going to be people who just clicked on a thumbnail on YouTube and they have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm here to tell you that you came at the perfect time, because the Odin 2 is an amazing device and really kind of changes the game for a lot of other devices that'll be coming in the future. That is to say that for about $300 plus shipping and all that stuff, you can get a device that has way better of a chip than you would expect and can play just about anything that can be emulated within Android. So we're going to walk through all of those components in this video here today, and I'm hoping that by the end you'll know exactly whether or not the Odin 2 is going to be a good match for you and your use case. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, I want to start at the very basics, and that is discussing what makes the Odin 2 just so good. And I think to answer that, we need to talk about what exactly is the Odin 2 in the first place. Well, I would say in its most rudimentary form, this is basically an Android tablet that has controls attached to it. So the experience is very similar to using an Android phone or tablet. You know, you install your emulators and games and then work from there. Now, there are a couple things that makes the Odin 2 unique. Number one, the chip inside is the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. And this is a very powerful chipset that are found in many high-end phones. However, many of those high-end phones are really expensive. It's very hard to find one that's going to be under $600. Now, somehow, AYN, which is the company behind the Odin 2, got their hands on this chipset at a good price. And so the price they're offering here far outclasses any sort of smartphone that has this chip. The base model comes in at $294 with 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. And that's what makes the Odin 2 so compelling. At this price point with this chipset, it is running circles around the competition. Now, they also offer upgraded options like the Odin 2 Pro. This one has 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. And the Pro model is what I'm reviewing here today. They also are going to be offering a Max model, 16 gigabytes with 512 gigs of storage. But if you ask me, I think that spec's a little bit overkill, and I think the Pro one is the one to get. Also of note, the Odin 2 is in a pre-order phase. They're expecting to start shipping it in December of this year. Now, like I mentioned before, setting up this device is very similar to an Android tablet or phone, and once you have everything set up, it is a bit of an inelegant experience. Now, AYN recognizes this, and they make what they call the Odin Launcher. This is a front-end application that will allow you to customize the look and feel of the device, and it does have some handy quick menus if you want to organize this down to the nitty-gritty. Now, in addition to the Odin Launcher, there are other third-party apps that do the job just as well, if not better. The one I often use is called Daijisho. This is a front-end launcher as well, but it is more centered on giving you a console-like experience. So you can tab through your different systems, then pick your game and launch them from there. And so that's basically the process for setting up the Odin 2. You're going to install all of your emulators and games, and then you can use a front-end launcher like Daijisho or something else that can kind of consoleize that experience. Now, I'm not going to walk you through that process here in this review video, but I do have an entire emulation starter guide made for Android. And this includes both a written guide and a video. I'll have it all linked down below in case you're interested. Anyway, back to our first topic, which is what makes the Odin 2 so good. Let's talk about some of my favorite things about this device. Number one, the device looks great. It reminds me a lot of a Nintendo Switch, but it has an old school flair. And I think it's really apparent in the blue transparent model that I have here as a review unit. Now, the device itself is a little bit larger than a Nintendo Switch Lite, and it's also quite a bit thicker. And so in that regard, I do not think it's a pocketable device. Yes, if you've got something with really big pockets, you can fit it in. But I think in a more daily use perspective, this is more like a portable device, something you would throw in a bag or maybe just kind of carry around the house. Now, in addition to that transparent blue, we've got a few other options. They also make a transparent purple, then a black model, as well as a Super Nintendo style gray model, and then a white one. However, one thing of note, that if you want any of the colored models besides black, you have to get the Pro model. The base model, the cheapest one, only comes in black. Anyway, I like the fact that we have 5 different color options to choose from, and for my part, I really do like this transparent blue. Now, each of these models also have light-up LEDs, both around the analog sticks and the sides of the device. And I think this is a pretty neat feature, and of course you can also turn it off in the settings if you don't want it. One thing of note is the light bleed is quite prominent on the transparent devices. Now, in my initial impressions video, I did mention the fact that I wish there was a way to turn down the brightness. It just seemed too bright for me. Well, it turns out I'm just kind of an idiot and I wasn't really using it the correct way. As you can see here, we have a full color spectrum to work with and we can assign the color however we'd like. What I didn't realize is that when you drag it down closer to black, that is going to dim the light itself. So if you want to dim the light, and you're probably going to want to do that with the transparent models, you just need to drag it more towards the bottom. And then of course you have the full spectrum of colors to choose from as well. Now, in addition to dimming the colors, if you move it from the left to the right, you can actually increase or decrease the saturation. So if you'd like to have something that's a little bit closer to white, you would move it to the left. And then if you want a more deep color, then you would move it as far as you can to the right. And I found that for the transparent models, this bottom right quadrant works the best. It gives you a really intense color, but not super bright. I've also found that I prefer not to use the analog stick LEDs just because they seem just a little bit odd with that kind of cross-style design. And of course you can turn off either set within the settings. So if anything, I like to have the side LEDs on. This gives it a nice kind of aura around the device itself, and it doesn't look half bad even in darker conditions. Now, if I was playing in pitch black, it might get a little bit distracting, especially on these transparent models, but it also kind of gives a cool 90s sort of vibe to it, and I kind of like that as well. Anyway, the RGBs are completely unnecessary, but I also really like that we have them and we've got quite a few options here. Now, another thing I like about this device, and I went into detail about it in my impressions video, are the controls. The analog sticks are a little bit small, but also magnetic Hall sensors, and they stick up quite a bit from the shell, giving you a lot of control. In addition, I really like the D-pad. This is a very precise kind of clicky D-pad. It's very similar to the D-pad on the PS Vita. It's very light to the touch and super accurate. They've also reconfigured the face buttons. These are much easier to press down on now and have just the perfect amount of travel. This was one of my main complaints about the first Odin, and so I'm very happy that they completely fixed them here. In addition, we've got full analog triggers that feel really great, and we have a very ergonomic device as well. I've been playing this for hours at a time with no cramping or any sort of issues whatsoever. Now, in addition to the outer design, the inner design is also very well made. In a quick teardown here, you can see that the CPU and all of the other components are hidden behind this heat shield, and we've also got a pretty large active fan, which is going to keep everything nice and cool. They've also slid the battery to the side, so there's no conflict between the heat of the battery and the CPU. And they've also segmented all the other parts, so things like the speakers and the rumble motors and even the controller boards are all separate from the motherboard. Another thing of note here is the speaker housing is much larger than you would expect from a device this size. When you combine this with the fact that we have front-firing speakers, we have some of the best audio that you can find in a handheld device at this price point. And let's go ahead and do a quick audio test. Now, I generally don't have huge expectations when it comes to audio on some of these handhelds, but all the same, I was really impressed with this one here. Anyway, another factor that's a positive for me with the Odin 2 is its repairability. If you ever need to replace something like a button or a D-pad or maybe even a speaker, all of this is going to be easily accessible on each of these controller boards. And for me, I really appreciate this concept because if you're going to be spending $300+ on a handheld, if something goes wrong, you don't want to have to just replace it outright. So I love the idea that you can get a repair part and then fix it in case something goes wrong. Now, there are some other upgrades on the Odin 2 that really are nice touches. For example, we have a dedicated back button here on the bottom right. This is especially important when it comes to gaming on an Android device because many of these emulators rely on a back button. This means when using an emulator like for GameCube or PlayStation 2, in order to bring up the quick menu to be able to exit out of a game or maybe save your state, all you have to do is just press this button on the bottom right. It's a little touch, but it's so much better than having to swipe across the screen and make a bunch of fingerprints. And also on the bottom left, we have a dedicated home button. So if you want to double tap that, it'll bring you right back to the Android interface. Now another big bonus for the Odin 2 comes from that chipset, in the fact that we have some excellent performance. Let's do a quick comparison here using God of War 2, one of the hardest PlayStation 2 games to emulate bar none. And here I'm running the game just in these standard settings at a 4x resolution, that's very close to 4K. The device itself has a 1080p screen, so we're actually pushing way more pixels than it even needs. All the same, you can see that it is running at full speed even when using OpenGL graphic backend, which honestly is not the most performant in the world, but it is very accurate. So this is performance well beyond anything else in the market. Let me show you a couple examples. To start, here's the original Odin. This is the Pro model, which has a Snapdragon 845, but it is overclocked. All the same, even when running it at the very highest performance mode, I'm running it at a 1x or native resolution, and it's only getting about 75% speed. This means you'll have to go into the settings and change other configurations and emulation hacks in order to get this even to work at a remotely full speed. Here's another example. This is the other Odin model called the Odin Lite. This one's cheaper, it's $199, but has a Dimensity 900 chip, which is less powerful. As a result, with those same settings, we're getting about 65% speed in God of War 2. There's also a number of different devices that use the Unisoc T618 chipset, including this one here, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. This is a great handheld, it comes in around $150 and I love it a lot, but it's definitely not powerful enough to play every PlayStation 2 game, and God of War 2 is a great example. Here I'm running again at a native resolution and we're getting about 55% speed, so it's nowhere close to being playable. As it stands, the only Android-based device that is even kind of in competition with the Odin 2 is the iNeo Pocket Air. This one also starts at around $300, but has a weaker Dimensity 1200 chip. Now the chip's still pretty good. I mean, we can get 3x resolution here with God of War 2, and it does have an OLED display, so there are some unique things going with this device. However, from a pure performance standpoint, it really can't stand toe-to-toe with the Odin 2. The fact that we're even getting a 4x resolution in this game is kind of insane to me. There's a huge jump between 3 and 4x. So specifically when it comes to performance, at this price point, there is nothing in competition in the Android space. And finally, the other thing that makes the Odin 2 so great is the battery life. The device has an 8,000 milliamp hour battery, which is very big for a device this size. So I did some battery testing. Let me talk a little bit about those results. To start, you have to think about this like an Android phone, which means that you can just tap on the power button to put it to sleep. And like any other phone, when you put it to sleep, it is going to get a little bit of battery drain, but it is pretty impressive that after 12 hours, it only lost about 2%. So this is a device that you don't really have to power off if you are going to be playing it often. You just can put it to sleep and then pick it back up and start playing again. And the device is also capable of power delivery, which means that you can charge it from 0 to full in a little bit under 2 hours. Anyway, for my battery testing itself, I did everything at a 50% brightness and 50% volume, and I did 3 different use cases. We'll start with the worst case scenario on the bottom right with Super Mario Odyssey on the Nintendo Switch. And for this one, I pulled out all the stops. I put it in the highest performance mode and turned the fan on the loudest mode as well. And after 1 hour of gameplay, I lost 26% battery. And if we make the calculation based on the entire battery, that means we should get about 3 hours and 51 minutes of battery life in a worst case scenario. And also bear in mind that many games will not require high performance mode at all. Now if we bring it back one step to just regular old performance mode and we put the fan in smart mode, which is going to be a little bit quieter, here I played Sly Cooper 3 on the PlayStation 2 at a 3x upscale or about 1080p resolution. Again, if we do some really complex math calculations, you can figure that out, that means about 10 hours of battery life when playing PlayStation 2 at 1080p. And finally, let's talk about a best case scenario. So we're going to play this at the lowest performance mode with the fan completely turned off. And after 1 hour, I lost 4% battery. That means that we can expect up to 25 hours of battery life when playing through old school retro games. So for me, these numbers are excellent. I have no complaints about the battery life on this device. In fact, I think it's one of the best out there. Okay, now that we've talked about all of the things that really stand out to me as being great components of the Odin 2, let's talk about some of the things that could be better about this device as well. Now, as a disclaimer, this doesn't mean that these things are bad, but I do think there is room for improvement. And we'll start with the screen. Now, this is a 1080p panel, so it's got a nice high resolution. It's also 6 inches in size, which is nice and large as well. And I think in terms of color balance and saturation, it looks pretty good to my naked eye. It's very easy to differentiate the various colors, and for me, the blue looks blue, the red looks red, and so on. So if anything, I would say it's a pretty decent display. However, the main complaint that I have is that it doesn't have a huge dynamic range between the overall brightness and dimness. You can see here as I toggle back and forth, there's not a huge range here. So if you want to play this in an outdoor condition with a really bright light, I don't think it's going to work super well. And on the other side, if you wanted to play this in a very dark condition, I don't think this is getting dim enough either. So if anything, these variances mean that I wouldn't want to play this device in an outdoor direct sunlight environment, and I also don't think that I would probably be playing it in a pitch black environment either. I think everything else will be fine if you're going to be playing it indoors or maybe in your car. All those things will be good. But I also like the idea of being able to play this in the dark in bed, and unfortunately I think it's just a little bit too bright. Now let's talk a little bit about color balance and how this compares to other screens. We'll start with the original Odin Pro. This one has what they call the version 1 screen. I think in terms of overall saturation, how blue the blue is and how green the green is, I think that the Odin 2 is better looking than the Odin 1. However, if you look at the tint or color balance, you can see that the red tint is a little bit more prominent in the Odin 2 than it is on the Odin 1. And I found this to be a trend among other devices that I compared it with. Here's the Odin Lite with its version 2 screen. And same thing here, it's a little bit more skewed on the red, but also more saturated on the Odin 2. Now I do think that these slight color differences are really only going to matter if you're comparing them screen for screen. When you're actually just looking at the Odin 2, I think it looks great. Now I think the color difference is a lot less stark when you compare it with the Analog Pocket. In fact, this one's just skewed a little bit more towards green than the Odin 2, but it is very, very close. And again here, I think the vibrancy of the colors are actually still more prominent on the Odin 2. In fact, I was surprised to find that the colors were a little bit more rich than on the Retroid Pocket 3, which has always been a pretty rich display. In fact, the only device I found that had a deeper saturation to it was the OLED panel on the Neo Pocket Air. And of course this makes sense because OLED colors just really pop. So really I don't have huge complaints about the screen other than that dimness and brightness thing, but I did want to show you the color range right here in case you prefer one over the other. Now another thing I got a lot of questions about was the input latency on the Odin 2. Now on the original Odin devices, there were quite a few people that had complaints about the input latency. Now personally, I'm not someone who's sensitive to input latency, but I still wanted to test it for everybody else. So there's a couple of ways I could have gone about it, but this is the way I did it. Number one, I used a high-speed camera at the max settings that I could, and then I recorded myself pressing the button in Super Mario World. And then I went through and recorded 8 other devices doing the exact same thing, exact same game, exact same settings, and all that. From there, I went and I took that footage and slowed it way down in my video editing software and then counted frame by frame. So I looked for the moment that the button pressed down, and then I counted how many frames it took until I saw Mario start to jump up. Now, in interest of full disclosure, I did not go back and do the calculations to determine how many milliseconds that was. And that's because I don't fully trust either the camera that I was using or my video editing software. So even though the iPhone that I used said it was recording in 240 frames per second, I don't think that was actually true. So instead of trying to calculate the response time knowing that it was probably going to be a flawed number, instead all I did is I compared the results against different devices to see which ones were faster than the others. And so here are the results, and you can see right now that obviously there's a bunch of devices with the exact same number. Again, this leads me to believe that there is some sort of flaw in the capturing technique that I used. However, instead of just throwing away the data, I did want to compare them against others because there was a difference with different devices. And so looking at the frames that I counted, the Analog Pocket has the lowest response time, and that makes sense because this device is known for having very minimal input lag. Now for a bunch of other devices, they all got exactly 119 frames between pressing the button and the jump. And this included a variety of Android devices, but then also Linux-based devices like the Powkiddy RGB30 and the Steam Deck. And by comparison, the Odin 2 was slower. It was 159 frames between the button press and the jump, which by the way is also the exact same number of frames that I got with the Odin Pro. And by the way, all of these Odin devices are running the latest version of the software, which has an input latency fix. Either way, based on my flawed technique of testing, I was able to see that yes, the Odin devices are a bit slower than others. And whether or not you can detect that is going to be up to you and how sensitive you are to this input latency. However, one thing to note, within the RetroArch app, which is going to be focused on retro game emulation, there's a feature called Run Ahead. And this will reduce input latency, but at the cost of performance. However, because this device is so powerful, you can use Run Ahead no problem here. In fact, I did a run ahead of 2 frames and then tested it all over again. And here you can see that with a 2x run ahead, I actually got much faster response times, even faster than the Analog Pocket. So I think if you are specifically concerned about input latency when it comes to retro games, the 2x run ahead is going to work out great. However, bear in mind this won't fix the input latency issues with standalone emulators, so things like GameCube and PS2. Anyway, when it comes down to it, for me personally, I did not detect any sort of input lag as I was playing, but for those who do have a concern about this, I did want to note that yes, I did test it to be just a little bit slower than other devices in the same range. And of course, whether or not that's a deal breaker is going to be 100% up to you. Okay, another thing that I think has room for improvement with the Odin 2 is the docked function. And really, this doesn't have to do with the Odin 2 itself, but just the complexities of docking an Android device. To start, I've connected this device via USB-C to my monitor, and then I've also connected the controller via Bluetooth. And when it comes to navigating the Android interface itself, it works out just fine, and there are certain emulators that'll pick up on that controller no problem. RetroArch is the best example. This one actually is a pretty seamless experience. So if you do want to play retro games while plugged into a monitor on Android, this actually works really well. However, the rub comes when you start to try to use any of those standalone emulators, because the majority of them have not been configured to be able to have multiple controllers hooked up at once. The RetroArch team did think through all this stuff, and so because of it, it is a pretty seamless experience. But when it comes to PlayStation 2 or GameCube or Nintendo Switch, it is not an ideal situation. For most of these emulators, it'll detect that it has those built-in controls on the Odin 2, and so by default, those are going to be the controls that it wants to use. So when you hook up a Bluetooth controller, what this means is you have to go into those emulator settings and then configure it for that controller instead. So it's not impossible by any means, but it is kind of a pain in the butt to have to go into the settings every time you want to dock it and then configure it for your Bluetooth controller. And then of course, when you want to undock it, you have to reconfigure it for the inbuilt controller. And this whole process just kind of takes away from the overall experience. It's not going to be seamless like a Nintendo Switch or something like the Steam Deck. The only thing that AYN could really do to improve this experience is to have a toggle where you could turn off the built-in controllers on the device. This might prompt a couple of those emulators to grab the Bluetooth controller instead. Now, AYN is also offering an updated version of what they call the Super Dock on their Indiegogo page, and it comes in at about $50, but unfortunately I don't have this one to test with just yet. But given the fact that all of these docks basically work exactly the same on Android, I don't have any high hopes that there's some sort of magical property that's going to make these work with external controllers. So again, it's not that the Odin 2 lacks any sort of docked feature, it's just that Android itself isn't really built for this kind of design. Now, if you're curious, this is what I ended up using for my dock. This is called the Ioneo Multi-Station, and it worked out just fine with the Odin 2. And I also have the older version of the Super Dock, which again should probably work the same, but unfortunately this one just doesn't fit the Odin 2. When it comes down to it, the new grips are just too prominent, so it doesn't fit inside. And finally, the last thing I think that the Odin 2 could do better has to do with their key mapping software. And this one's a little bit strange, but the right joystick adjust view mode doesn't have the ability to invert the X or Y axis. And for someone like me who plays inverted, this is kind of a bummer. The weird thing is that the original Odin software had this as an option, and I used it all the time. So my hope here is that as they improve the software, they're going to bring this feature back into the Odin 2. Because as it stands right now, the key mapping software works great just like it did with the original Odin. So if you want to play a game like Call of Duty Mobile that does not have built-in controller support, you can map all the functions to button presses within that software. However, as it stands right now, my inability to invert that y-axis just makes it a lot harder for me to actually enjoy this experience. So fingers crossed, I hope that they implement this in a future software update, especially because they've done it before. Okay, so those are the standout features of the Odin 2, as well as some of the things that I think can be improved. Now I want to spend some time talking about just the overall experience of playing this and what kind of performance you can expect on this device. To start, we'll talk about some of those retro systems, so absolutely no issue here. Of course, you can play these retro games no problem. The biggest thing of note here is a 6-inch display is really great for retro gaming, especially if you're a little bit older or maybe have bad eyesight. The other great thing is that this is so powerful that it can play all sorts of other systems. For example, you can play Sega Saturn, but not only Sega Saturn, but you can upscale it to 1080p. Most devices in this price point can't even play all Saturn games at full speed, let alone with an upscaled resolution. And of course, all those other 3D-based systems, PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, all these will also play absolutely no problem with an upscaled resolution. I also found that one of my favorite systems to play on this device was PlayStation Portable, and I want to give you a quick example of why it's so fun to play some of these games on the Odin 2 over others. For example, a great way to play PlayStation Portable games is on a PS Vita. The Vita has a perfect 2x integer scale of the original PSP display. This means that all the PSP games are going to play absolutely fine, and they basically play natively on the device as well. However, the PS Vita does not have the ability to upscale most of these PSP games. And so as a result, when you blow up something that was already a little bit pixelated back in the day into a screen that's twice the size, what you end up with is something that's even more pixelated than when it was originally. And so while it is very impressive to play PlayStation Portable games on a 5-inch screen like this, it does leave quite a bit to be desired from a graphical standpoint. Now, if we transform that over into the Odin 2, we can play this at a full 1080p or 4x resolution upscale. And the difference here is just night and day. It's like playing a remastered version of those PSP classics. So absolutely, this is one of my favorite ways to play PlayStation Portable content. Now that being said, I still think the best way to play PlayStation Vita content is on an original PS Vita, because unfortunately the emulation development for PS Vita is still kind of in its growing stages. So yes, there is a PlayStation Vita emulator on Android, and it's pretty easy to get set up. And it's also made a lot of progress over the past few months, but all the same, I still don't think it's game ready. Many of the lighter weight games will play fine. In fact, some of these will actually play at a 2x upscaled resolution. But when you start to get to some of those more heavyweight titles, which I imagine are probably the PlayStation Vita titles that most people want to play anyway, you'll find that there are quite a few issues. Number one, some of these will not run at full speed, and it's also likely that they will have a lot of graphical issues, which just kind of takes away from the gameplay experience. So if anything, I would say don't buy the Odin 2 for PlayStation Vita content, but maybe in the coming months and years this will get better. Also of note, the gyroscope controls work out great on the Odin 2, so if you want to use an emulator that supports it, something like PlayStation Vita, 3DS, or even Nintendo Switch, it'll all work out really well. Speaking of 3DS, let's talk about this system. So I'm using the Canary build of the official Citra emulator, and literally all I've done here is just gone and mapped all of my controls and then turned on the resolution to the max it can go, which is 4x upscale. In addition, I switched it over to the Vulkan graphical backend and then just started booting up games and playing them. And as you can see, these games are playing great, including some that I never thought were going to be actually playable on an Android device, like Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed. With other devices, this game just crawls to like 5 frames per second, so it's really surprising to see it running at full speed. Now this emulator will present some stutters here and there, it's just kind of how it's built and how it emulates, but all the same, I think it's a really great experience. Now the systems that everyone asks about with this device are GameCube and Wii and PlayStation 2, so let's talk about those next. And the way I see it, when it comes to emulation on these systems, there's a specific thing I have in mind. And that is, from a general user perspective, I don't want to have to mess with the settings. Instead, my ideal device is so powerful that it can just kind of barrel through all of those tweaks and I don't have to worry about them. And so that's how I approached this entire setup with all these systems. So all I'm doing here is just adding my ROMs, and then I went into the graphics settings and set it to a 3x resolution. That's going to be higher than 1080p, so again, it'll be perfect for this display. And I'm happy to report, without having to make any sort of other configuration changes, yes, every GameCube game I tried played at full speed. In fact, I didn't even have to mess around with the Vulkan backend, which usually performs better but has a lot of glitching. Instead, I just used OpenGL and everything worked great. And for Nintendo Wii, it's a very similar story, a 3x resolution again and not messing around with any of these settings. In fact, I spent most of my time just setting up the controls because it is kind of difficult to convert the Wiimote inputs into something that'll work with a handheld device. Either way, yes, 3x resolution worked really well. I would get a little bit of slowdown as shaders were compiling, but that was really about it, and it was very minimal. And of course, I'm happy to report that PlayStation 2 is a very similar experience. Again, I just kept it on OpenGL, turned it up to a 3x resolution, and just started playing. The only other thing I really did is just made sure that all the stats were present here on the screen in case you wanted to read them as I was playing. Now, I had a lot of requests for specific games, and so I tried my best to test each of those for you, and so I'm gonna just kind of let this play for a couple minutes in case you want to watch this and maybe your favorite game was shown. Either way, just rest assured that I didn't have to make any sort of configuration change other than just adding the ROM and turning it on. Okay, and finally, from an emulation standpoint, let's talk about Nintendo Switch for a moment. I already did a whole dedicated video about this, but I did want to reiterate the fact that yes, this works pretty well as a Nintendo Switch device, but not perfectly. And most of that has to do with the development of the emulator itself and not necessarily the power behind the device. Anyway, if you want to know more about Nintendo Switch emulation on this device, I'll leave it linked down below. Next, let's talk a little bit about just general Android things. We'll start with Android gaming. Now, I spent most of my time testing emulation instead of actual Android games, but I did want to at least show that at a high settings with 60 frames per second, Genshin Impact actually plays really well. And of course, I'm using that key mapping software that I mentioned before to make sure that the controls actually work. Now, it wasn't 100% perfect. I did get a couple stutters here and there in some heavyweight kind of battle scenes, but all the same, this was a completely playable experience for me. Also, one thing of note, you can see that little 50% bar in the top left. That's the total RAM usage while playing this game. This means that this particular heavyweight game requires about 6 of the 12 gigabytes of RAM that I have on this device. And if you're doing the math, that means that the base version or the $299 model with 8 gigabytes of RAM will also get these same results. Another question I got a lot was remote play and streaming. So we'll start with the remote play first. Here I am logged into my Xbox remotely here within my home Wi-Fi. And I tried a couple different methods. Number one, just through the regular Xbox app, but then also a third-party app called XB Play. I really like this one because it's made by the same maker as PS Play, which works for the PlayStation 4 and 5. But what I like about this one is it gives you more fine-tuned controls over the picture, and then also it's a lot sharper too. I don't 100% understand how this works, but I think it's tricking it into thinking that this is a web browser on a PC. And so as a result, you get a higher resolution signal than you would from the Xbox app. Either way, from a remote play or local streaming standpoint, I think this is going to work great for both Xbox, PlayStation, and even PC streaming through something like Moonlight. Next, let's talk a little bit about cloud gaming. So here I'm going to be using the Xbox Game Pass app, and so I'm streaming this game over the cloud, and so I'm not actually playing from an Xbox, but really from Microsoft servers. One thing of note here is that I'm not the best test case for this because I live in Hawaii and the lag here is pretty bad. But yes, I did want to show that cloud streaming will work just fine on this device, and depending on how close you are to a Microsoft server, you'll probably get better performance than me. Okay, as we start winding down, I want to answer the question of whether or not the Odin 2 is going to be worth it for you. And I think there's a couple factors to consider. Number one, from an Android standpoint, this is definitely the best in the business right now. However, I got quite a few comments from people saying that should I buy this or the Steam Deck because the price point after shipping and all that are pretty similar compared to the low-end version of the Steam Deck. And I think that's a valid comment, given the fact that if we want to get that middle tier model, the one with different colors and all that, it's going to be $370 before shipping and taxes. So really you are looking at something that's going to be a little bit over $400 at the end of the day. And lo and behold, when not on sale, the low tier Steam Deck is $399 with free shipping. So I think there is a valid argument that yes, the Steam Deck is something worth your consideration at this price point. So there are a few factors to consider, but probably most prominent among them is going to be the size difference between the two. And I think there's a lot of people out there who want something that's powerful, but just not quite as big as the Steam Deck. And as you can see, there's quite a big difference between these two in terms of size, despite the fact that there's only really about a 1-inch difference between the screens. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to try out a Venn diagram. And of course, with a Venn diagram, we need a third party. So I'm going to grab a random, cheaper handheld, something that's under $100. And for this example, we're going to use the Powkiddy RGB30. This one comes in at $90 with free shipping. I just recently made a video about this one. It is definitely one of my favorite devices of this year. In fact, when it comes to small handhelds for both enthusiasts and people just starting to get into the hobby, I think this device is a really great choice. So we'll compare all three of these together, the Odin 2, the RGB30, and then also the Steam Deck. Now, I don't want to dive into all of these, but I'm just going to kind of leave this up on here. I'm going to expect that you can pause. And here you can see some of the things that these devices do better than the others. For the Odin 2, the factors that stand out from the others are the fact that it can play Android games, and the streaming setup is pretty effortless when you compare it to the Steam Deck and the RGB30. From there, you can look at the other components that the Odin 2 can do, but the other ones can as well. So for example, if you want GameCube and PlayStation 2 and 3DS and maybe Nintendo Switch emulation for around the same price, then the Steam Deck should be worth your consideration. However, if other factors like battery life and portability and whether or not it can actually ship worldwide is important to you, then the Odin 2 and the RGB30 are probably going to be a better bet in that regard. And of course, the other devices can do things that the Odin 2 cannot. So for example, with the Steam Deck, it can play PC games, and then also it can emulate Wii U, PlayStation 3, and even Xbox. Along those same lines, if you're looking for something that's more pocketable or cheaper, and really you only want to play up to maybe PlayStation 1, then the RGB30 might be a better fit for you. So when it comes down to it, it's a very personal decision of whether or not the Steam Deck or the Odin or even something cheaper is a better fit. But I think where the Odin 2 really shines is that it's a smaller device compared to the Steam Deck, but then also has much longer battery life. In addition, it's so powerful that it can play some of the systems that really just aren't possible elsewhere. In particular, PlayStation 2, Wii, and GameCube are basically flawless. So when all those things are considered, if you are in the hunt for an Android-based device, then yes, the Odin 2 is a really good deal. So let's assume that you have narrowed down that between a cheaper device and the Steam Deck, the Odin 2 is a better fit for you, and you're still waiting for a little bit of a nudge to say whether or not it's worth buying right now. Well, I've got you covered there as well. We're going to play something called the Odin 2 buying role-playing game. What we're going to do here is we're going to assume that you have 1 hit point. So you're on the brink of death playing Dragon Warrior, you're up against a slime, and you've got 7 different factors to consider on both the positive and negative side. So what I would recommend doing here is read through each of these, and if any of them apply to you, then check mark that box. Every time you pick a negative trait, then you're going to go down 1 hit point. Every time you pick a positive one, you'll go up. And then after you've gone through these 14, what I want you to do is add up your total and see how you stand. And if you have 0 or less hit points, then I think you're dead. It's not worth buying the Odin 2. However, if you have positive hit points, and the higher the better, then this might be a really great fit for you right now. So in the end, here's how I see it. The Odin 2 is by far the best Android device I've ever used, and for me this device is so good that it makes me kind of just want to quit this YouTube channel and just play video games instead. And it's very rare that a device will actually make me feel that, but the Odin 2 definitely does. To put it in perspective, when it comes to retro gaming, it's one of the best devices out there. It has really nice controls, a big and bright screen, and battery life that can literally last for days. It also happens to be one of the best PSP games that I've ever played because of that high resolution display. And thanks to that really powerful chipset, it can handle things like GameCube upscaled, same thing with PlayStation 2 and Wii. And it's no slouch when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation. In fact, many of my favorite games play on this device no problem whatsoever. So when it comes down to it, I think the main question is going to be whether or not something like PlayStation 2 and GameCube are that important to you. Because the Odin 2 is finally that device that has 0 compromise when it comes to playing those 2 systems in particular. And over the years, I've seen so many comments from people saying that they would pay any amount of money to have a portable PlayStation 2 or GameCube. And I think in the case of the Odin 2, this is where the rubber meets the road. So in summary, GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Wii, if those are important to you, then yes, the Odin 2 is a great buy. But if you just want to play every system that's below that, you can find something for definitely cheaper. Anyway, that's about it for this video, and I appreciate you spending the time with me as I rant about one of my favorite devices to ever release in this space. It makes me really excited to see what's coming out in the months and years ahead. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick up an Odin 2, or is there still something that's holding you back? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.